right. I am Victor Kinzer. I'm a senior customer success manager here at Kuali. I recognize a lot of people on this call, so I suspect several of you know me, have worked with me, or are working with me currently. This is the compliance system administration training. So I'm going to be going through at a high level how to do system administration in the compliance modules. So we're going to be looking at both conflict of interest as well as protocols. We're not going to be looking at the form designer. There's a session on that I'll be running tomorrow morning at the same time. So we're really just going to be looking at what are the configuration options, what can you do in the system. I suspect we'll probably spend a little bit more time on conflict of interest than protocols just because of some new things that we've done in COI that I want to be sure to take the time to highlight. Um, but I'm going to try and get through a description of what are all the major configuration options and how do you configure them in both modules. So with that said, let's jump in. So the first thing I want to do is just show you how to navigate around, how to get where you're going. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to manage permissions in the system. So this is the Kuali Research dashboard, which most of you are probably familiar with. And if we come down here, there's this little icon in the lower left-hand corner. If we extend the sidebar, it's switch apps. And we're going to go ahead and come over here and look at groups. Groups are where all the permissions for protocols are and some of the permissions for COI. And I'll show you how to maintain the rest of the permissions for COI. But we're going to start in groups because it's the common interface. So groups is going to have your organizational hierarchy in it. It's going to have all of your departments, deans, all of the units in the hierarchy. And I'm going to go ahead and come here to the top level because that's almost always going to have the university hierarchy. All the permissions here descend that hierarchical structure. So if you give someone a permission at that top university level, they will have it for all units in your hierarchy. Units could be departments, schools, centers. Unit is the general term we apply to any of those nodes in your hierarchy. If, however, we were to come down to a lower level and I were to assign a permission in cardiology, then that permission would only apply to cardiology and then any units that report up to cardiology. So for things like IRB viewer, or if you wanted to assign, say, reporting access to one of the compliance modules just at a unit level, that's how you would do that. So we're going to go back to the top. Most of the time, we're going to be managing permissions at this top level. And I'm going to come in here. And for those of you who implemented the system a while ago, you're going to see probably quite a few more roles than you're used to seeing here. So we've added some roles recently, and there are some new options in the system. And I just want to kind of talk through what lives here in groups. So the first thing are the admin roles. IRB admin, iCook admin, IBC admin, those are going to be your functional power users. Those are the people who can go in, they can assign protocols to meetings, they can approve protocols, they can do all of those kind of functional power user actions. But then we also have IRB system configurer, iCook, and IBC system configurer. So we broke out that role. So that's for anyone that needs to set up new ancillary reviews, manage the templates, change notification behavior. We wanted to really partition off who had power to make changes to the way the system behaved. For a small institution, they might be the same person as the admin. They often are. But at a larger institution where you might have a compliance office with 10, 20 analysts, it is unlikely that you want all of them to be able to go in and change email configurations. So we have that set up as a separate role now. Then we have the triage role. The triage role is something that, again, is mostly useful when you have a fairly large office. You know, if you only have one or two admins, they might want to see everything that comes into the office. But if you have 10, 15, 20 analysts, they don't all want an email every time a new protocol is submitted to the office. They just want to be notified when something is assigned to them. So you can set up a triage role. You can set up 2 or 3 people who are responsible for triaging all the documents that are submitted for that particular protocol type and then doing assignment. And then that's available as a notification role. The permission on the triage role is very limited. That individual can only go in, really, they can see all the protocols, and then they can assign the protocols to other people. They have access to that, the assigned reviewers page where you can assign committees, review types, reviewers, but they can't take other actions. They can't make action items. They can't do other sorts of actions in the system. They don't get their own checklist. But if you want the triage staff to have all the power of an admin, you would just add them to both roles. But the notifications are still going to limit that so that they only go to the people who are in the triage role. So you can combine these roles to get to the level of access that you need in the system. And then there is a new role. You can see down here, IRB department lead. This role isn't quite out for public consumption yet. We're testing this functionality, so you won't see this in your environment if you check today, but you will see it in the near future. This is a notification role, so you can go in and set up department chairs or department admins that can be notified whenever actions are taken on protocols in their department. There are several institutions that want those notifications to go out. They don't necessarily require formal approval at the department level. Some other ways to do that I'll talk about a little later. But they do want notifications to go out to certain people whenever actions are taken in their department. And so that gives us that level of notification functionality. The other two roles that have been around for a while that I want to talk about are the user and the viewer role. The user role, not a lot of institutions are leveraging. You have the option in the system to either configure protocols so that anyone at your institution can create a document, or you can set it up so that only someone with this user role can create a document. So if you want to kind of minimize the population that can go in and create documents, you can manage that via this role, but then you have to have someone that goes in and provisions that access whenever there's a new researcher or a new admin that's going to submit on behalf of the researcher. It is a fair bit of overhead, but the option is available in the system. And then the viewer role is more used for department admins that just need to have access to say everything in their department, or say an OSP office that wants to be able to search protocols and make sure that a protocol listed on a grant is up to date. So you might assign that at the university level. So these are the major roles on the protocol side. On the conflict of interest side, there are really only two roles that are leveraging groups right now. We're trying to eventually get everything over into groups, but it's been an iterative process for conflict of interest. The first one is the COI report viewer. Anyone you add to that role will gain access to the conflict of interest reports. And then the other one is the COI viewer role. So the COI viewer role gives access to see all of the disclosures in the system. The COI viewer does have a fairly limited visibility. They can see things that are already approved. They can know the actions that have been taken in their department. They don't see things that are in progress, that are currently routing. This is more about giving access to a department to just be able to go in and confirm what's processed for their given department. They also don't see all the comments and regulatory details. So this is more of a high level what's completed sort of reporting output more than anything. So it is a somewhat limited role, but it can be very useful if you need to give access to, again, an OSP office so they can go in and check and confirm that disclosures are finished. Or if you wanted to give access to, say, department chairs or certain administrators in departments to what had been submitted, by their researchers. So to make changes here, I'm going to click Edit Group. And now I can come here and say we want to add someone as a COI viewer. I just have to type in and look up their name. And so I can add Inez Chu and say I want to remove Emery Eagle as an IRB user. I can just hit the little trash can icon. These changes have now been made to the roles at this particular level of the unit hierarchy, and I'm going to click Done. And that's really all that's involved in changing these permissions. there any questions about any of that? Okay. Just to confirm, to make changes to groups, you do need to have a core admin level. So you have to be a power user at your institution. So if you feel like this is something you should be allowed to do and you get into groups and then you don't have the right to edit or make changes, you just want to contact the top level administrators at your institution. They should be able to grant you that permission. So now I'm going to come down here to switch apps and we're going to go back to Research Home. And I'm going to talk about where the other conflict of interest permissions live. And then we're going to talk about some of the conflict of interest configurations in the system. So I'm going to come here and click on all links. And we're going to search for role. When I search for role, I'm going to search for wildcard, COI space wildcard. The search systems in the research monolith are still using that old wildcard system. So I'm going to press enter, and then we're going to see all of the COI roles in the system. Don't worry about COI viewer. We're not really leveraging that right now, but we are using COI administrator and COI reviewer. So if I were to click edit here, that would open this roll up. And when we first released conflict of interest, the groups application I showed you didn't exist yet. And so that's why we built the permissions here. We will eventually move them over to groups and off of the monolith. But I can come here, and if I know a username, I can just type it in name. I do need to indicate what unit of the hierarchy we are linking that permission to. And I'm going to indicate that it descends the hierarchy. And that's how we add Inez Chu. In order to remove a permission, I would need to edit the permission. And then that's going to bring it up here. I can click deactivate, and that's going to put an end date. So if I know that someone's going to be leaving 2 weeks from now, they just put in their notice, and I just want to go ahead and, process their deprovisioning and get it out of the way, I can schedule that to take effect the day after their last day, effectively the first day that they are no longer in a role where they should have this permission. So that can be a nice way that you don't have to remember the morning of or the evening of to deprovision, and you can schedule it. It avoids you doing it a half hour before they leave and they still have some final tasks and those sorts of issues. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this with those changes. And then the COI reviewer role is managed the same way. So I'm not going to show you that interface, but the reviewer role defines who can be a reviewer in the system. And you can automatically assign reviewers when a disclosure is submitted based on their place in the unit hierarchy. So someone in chemistry will automatically be assigned as a reviewer whenever any researcher from chemistry submits a disclosure. Or you can have it be ad hoc. You add people as a reviewer and they're available to be added sort of ad hoc to the review. One thing I recommend to schools that are using their unit hierarchy to automatically assign reviewers is that you add a unit to your unit hierarchy that reports up to the very top level. So no one will ever report up to this unit, just called COI reviewer. And any individuals that you want to be ad hoc, put there. And that way they won't inadvertently be automatically assigned when just the right person submits a disclosure. So I do recommend that setup. It's fairly simple to put into place. And that way you can mix the kind of ad hoc committee reviews with the automatic departmental reviews that you need to complete as part of your disclosure process. So there is one other configuration that I want to go over here in the monolith. And I also want to mention sponsor hierarchy. So you do manage your sponsor groups via sponsor hierarchy, but Kat is going to be going over that in the SP system administration training. So I'm not going to go into the details of sponsor hierarchy here. It's a relatively straightforward process. And if you have a group of sponsors that require COI disclosure, you would set them up there. As you'll see a little bit later, you might have multiple groups of sponsors that require disclosure and different behavior in the system. And you can just set up multiple hierarchies and then link those to conflict of interest. But the other configuration that I want to show you is fairly new. So I'm going to come over here to all links, and we're going to look up a parameter. And I'm going to search for question. We have this new parameter that's called passive COI disclosure question IDs. So the purpose of this parameter is you can now drive COI disclosure based off of a question in the proposal. So you can see here we have 2 question IDs listed. The way this functionality works is if on any proposal, either of those questions is answered yes, so answered in the affirmative, then it will send information to the COI system that says this project requires disclosure. It's still dependent on the way you have sponsor hierarchy configured and roles and everything else that's available in the system. But this allows you to have a configuration where maybe at the proposal stage, you don't want everyone to have to go in to the COI system and set everything up. You just want, if they say yes to a question that asks, do you have any significant financial entities, then you want to send them through that process. So you could do that kind of screening. As you'll see, we have other ways to minimize that activity in the system. The more common use I've seen for this is I've seen institutions that require disclosure on all projects that then don't want to require disclosure, say, on an unfunded agreement or all their service agreements. So they'll have questions or questionnaire generally that appears, and then they have, you know, a drill-in question. If certain criteria are met, we do want you to disclose. And so you can have an extra level of screening to really work to minimize just the administrative overhead. How often are you going to ask your researchers to go in and get into the system? So it's fairly nuanced. You can set up these questions to be in the main proposal questionnaire, and if it's answered yes, everyone gets the S flag, or you can set these questions up to be in the person certification, and only the individuals that answer yes on their certification would then have to disclose in COI for that particular project. I'm not going to go through all the configurations on that because it would take a while, but again, if you go to the SP training, you know how questions and questionnaires are set up. That's really, those are the remaining pieces of how you'd configure that. Are there any questions about that? I know that's new and a little bit more involved to describe. Okay, that sounds good. Then we are going to go ahead and come over here to switch apps, and I'm going to come over to conflict of interest. So now that I'm in conflict of interest, we're going to spend most of our time here on the general configuration screen, and I'm going to talk through the options. The way you configure most of these things is you check a box. The nuance is in what do these boxes really do? So I want to talk about that in some detail. First is the difference between a static annual date and a rolling annual due date. A static date is you always have to submit a disclosure by September 1st or your disclosure expires. A rolling annual due date is you have to submit a disclosure within a year of your last disclosure. There are lots of reasons that this is beneficial, but it's especially beneficial if you're using project integration because it's really going to spread things out and you avoid situations where someone had a project, you know, at the end of July and now it's the beginning of September and they don't understand why they have to disclose again. And really, there isn't a federal reason, there isn't a regulatory reason for them to have to disclose again. But a lot of institutions had to maintain those annual cycles, especially on paper, just because it was very difficult to have a mechanism to know, did you disclose a year ago? Now we can manage that in the system. We're not going to worry about allow admin to overwrite due date on approval. That should not be used in production. That is intentionally meant that is meant as a mechanism to test expiration notifications for schools that are implementing. So not really an option for production. Allow configuring which sponsor hierarchies expire. We increasingly have institutions that want to maintain multiple COI policies on their books. And a couple of those policies, a couple of the state policies, don't expire the same way that federal project disclosures expire. You disclose once, it's the researcher's responsibility to update if things change perhaps, but they don't have to do anything on an annual basis. So we wanted to have an option in there that said, okay, you have federal projects, we're going to apply the federal expiration regulation. If you don't have federal projects, we're not going to expire your disclosure. So this is about being able to indicate which hierarchies apply to that situation. And so we could come here and look up a different hierarchy if we wanted to. Um, but in this case, we only want the PHS items to expire. I had mentioned earlier about automatically assigning reviewers based on the unit hierarchy. This will turn on that behavior. You can leave that turned off. Automatically approve annual disclosures that do not have any financial entities. In a situation where someone has no financial entities, they're just certifying, no, I don't have anything above these federal thresholds, there's really nothing to review. And for most institutions, you're looking at 90 to 97% of their disclosures fall into that category. You're really collecting a certification at that point. You're not really reviewing any disclosure. So it is possible to have those automatically approved. I'm going to jump out of the screen for a second because I want to go over to dispositions because this functionality does relate to dispositions. So here we have the dispositions that can be assigned to a disclosure or to a project. This is a very long, comprehensive list of dispositions. Some institutions will only have 3 or maybe 4 of them. The thing to be aware of with that auto approval is whichever disposition is at the bottom of this list will automatically be assigned to any auto approved disclosures. And it will automatically be assigned to any projects not previously dispositioned that are on that particular disclosure. Now, you might ask, if you have no financial entities and everything's all, everything would already be dispositioned, why would you need to have that nuance of only items that don't previously have a disposition? The reason for that is all of these items that say 700U, and I had mentioned, we're covering other conflict of interest policies, not just the federal ones. It is possible to have a situation where you have no financial entities. You have 700U, which is a California disclosure requirement that we have, full integration for. And the auto approval for 700U is a little bit more nuanced. If you don't have new projects with disclosures on 700U and you have no financial entities, it will auto approve. But if you have new 700U projects that have indicated a disclosure, then it will submit for approval. I won't go too deep into that because it only applies to a small population of institutions, but that's why there is that nuance. For most people, it's just important to know you need to keep the disposition that you want auto-assigned at the bottom of this list at all times. So let's go ahead and come back to the general configuration. The next one, do not require researchers with no entities to update their annual disclosure when they have a new project. I don't recommend using this. We have another newer configuration in the system that really replaces this one, and it's a lot more reliable. It has more flexibility. So I'm going to jump down to that one. It's what I actually recommend institutions have turned on. And that is, do not require researchers to update their disclosures for new projects if no incomplete fields are added to the disclosure. Those sound very different, but this option basically encompasses this option. So if you have no financial entities and you get a new project, then chances are there's nothing to fill out. You have no financial entities to declare on. There's no relationship that you could disclose on. And so the way the system is configured, the fields that sort of display by default won't be there. So if you're using the do not require researchers to update if they have no new fields, then the same behavior will take place. I have a new project, I have no financial entities, I don't have to update. That's great. Where it adds extra nuance is most institutions will take basically the maximum common denominator of the federal COI policies and create a local policy that covers all their bases. They'll say any financial entities above the $5,000 threshold require disclosure, just in general, because that is the more restrictive option between PHS and NSF. But they'll say, we require you to declare on the relatedness between your financial entities and your projects, which is an NSF requirement, not a PHS requirement. And so most institutions, for simplicity, they create one policy that covers their bases, and that's that. However, the system is now capable of splitting that difference. If you don't want to take that approach, so say you want to have one question that displays if a user only has non-PHS federal, say they have a lot of NSF research, but no PHS, that asks, do you have any financial interests above the $10,000 threshold? That's great. You have that display. They have financial entities, they submit, and you don't have to get declaration at the proposal stage for NSF. You just have to have the financial entities. So you configure proposals to not show declarations at all. So if I have a new proposal, that's fine. Then I don't have any new fields, even though there's a new project. My disclosure isn't expired, so then I won't get a notification. It minimizes noise. But then I get a PHS proposal. I've never had NIH before. And suddenly that first question changes. It's no longer the $10,000 threshold, it's a $5,000 threshold. And so now that is a new field, and the system will update me and say, you need to go update your disclosure. It no longer meets the regulatory requirements of your project profile. Because we have those moving pieces, because you can set up progressive display to tell those differences, maybe you don't show declarations at all at the award stage for NIH because NIH says, you know, it's the institution's responsibility to do this. The researcher doesn't have to declare. Then maybe you don't ask someone with a new NIH award to update their disclosure. That's more something you manage internally, that someone needs to go and look at that and check that. You could set that up and shift the burden from researcher to central office. It just depends on your local culture. And this feature, if set up very simply, will work exactly like this feature, but if you set up more nuance and complexity in your template, it gives you a lot more flexibility. It gives you additional options. So I, in general, just recommend that you use the no additional fields option. That was a lot of talking and a lot of description. Are there any questions about that from anyone? Okay.
There were a couple questions in the chat. I wanted to make sure you saw those.
I have not seen those come up, but let's take a look at those. So, do roles automatically descend hierarchy? Yes, they do. They automatically descend hierarchy. That is not something that can be configured in groups. The new PD parameter, passive COI disclosure question, can a future pre-award user group meeting include an agenda item? Yeah, I can definitely mention that to Marisa and see if that's a topic that she could go over. Um, yeah. All right. Hide batch disposition assignment, straightforward. I only recommend it if you're doing multiple policies that relate to projects. We added that again because of the California 700U, because batch assigning things didn't make sense and just sort of caused confusion and problems with the multiple policies that could apply to different projects. So we gave an option to hide it if it didn't make sense for an institution. Declare once on award hierarchy. So each project shows up in conflict of interest as its own sort of piece of a disclosure. And each award counts as its own project. And for schools that have very large, complicated award hierarchies, you had each award document and the hierarchy showing up as its own project, which was really problematic. So if you turn on declare once on an award hierarchy, the entire hierarchy will be collapsed into a single project. It reduces white noise on researchers' disclosures. It's configurable because depending on how you're using award hierarchy, that might not be appropriate, or it might not always be appropriate. So that is configurable. You can turn it off if you do need those multiple nodes to display. But for most uses of award hierarchy that we've seen, schools do want the entire award to be treated as a single item for the researcher. Disclose once at the PD IP stage and have the disclosure carry over to award. I've talked with Jessica Peck. She's doing a presentation later this week on hidden gems in compliance. She's going to be going into this in more detail. But basically what this does is it takes your proposal development document, and when it gets approved, instead of then having proposal development and IP, or not really tracking what's going on during the IP stage, which some schools do, the proposal development turns into the IP in conflict of interest and then turns into the award. It lets you track whether or not proposals are rejected, and it lets you track the proposal validity all the way through to award closeout. And it really minimizes the white noise on your researchers' disclosures. It also allows you to pull declarations forward. One of declarations aren't required till the award stage in terms of the regs, but gathering them at the proposal stage and having them pull forward to award automatically can really save a lot of time and review, and it can minimize, how often awards get held up because we're waiting on the fullness of COI review and submission. So there are a lot of advantages to that configuration option. And that's what that allows you to do. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely suggest watching the Hidden Gems or attending the Hidden Gems presentation. I'm not going to dig into the reset dispositions on all projects. This is another 700U specific configuration. Just know we need dispositions being reset to be handled differently for 700U than we do for federal, and that's to manage that. Allow reporters or their delegates to request disclosures be returned for edits. So this, I missed one, I apologize. Allow reporters to delegate preparation of their disclosure to other users. We have the option to set up delegates if you want. Not all schools want this functionality. Say maybe a quarter to a third do. If you have delegates set up, then the researchers can assign their own delegates. They're responsible for saying, this is the unit admin in my department. I want to be able to hand them my, investment portfolio, my work contracts, and say, here, please put all this into the system for me. But then once all of that's entered in the system, it's then up to the researcher to go in and confirm it. Another person cannot submit a disclosure on a researcher's behalf, but they can prepare it for the researcher. And so turning that on activates all of that system. And then allow reporters or delegates to request a disclosure be returned for edits. Because we have a single disclosure document that has all of your financial entities and all of your projects, that provides a lot of power in terms of recertifying everything every time something's submitted. It's what allows us to have that rolling due date, which is a big benefit, minimizes quite a bit of administrative burden. That interface is what allows us to not require the researcher to go in and touch things every time there's a new project if there are no new actual requirements. But the one thing about it is it's a whole document. If you submit a fairly complicated disclosure for review, and there are entities and there is potential relationships, so it's going to take a while for that review to happen. And in that time, you get a new project, you have to have that disclosure sent back to you so you can add the new project, and that can be integrated into the review, and you don't hold up proposals or awards, especially because maybe that project doesn't have any conflicts. So what this allows you to do is set up a configuration where the researcher, if they open their disclosure, they can request that it be sent back to them and notify the COI office that that request has taken place. It displays in the document and notifications go out. You can also sort of run reports on that in the system of which disclosures have send back requests. So you could set up a filter that you say check every day just to see if there are any of those hanging out there. Next, we have the 700U options. Again, I'm not going to go deep into 700U. That's a very kind of specific use case. So I've talked through fairly quickly, making sure I save time for protocols, everything on this screen. Are there any questions that anyone has about any of this? Okay. Then the next thing I'm going to jump into is project types. So you can create you can create custom projects. So projects that you come in manually, and if you come here, this is where you would do that creation. So if I open up one of these, you can see what I'm able to configure. I'm able to configure the name of the project. What are the roles I want to list on the project? They might not be the same roles that are used for the grants. And then what are the statuses we're going to check, and then the award type that can be listed. The award type is not entered through the manual project process. The award type is meant for integration. So if you're integrating a third-party system and pushing projects from your local grant system into conflict of interest, which we support for standalone COI, you might want to differentiate say that difference between unfunded and then funded, and what do we actually want to require disclosure for. So you may have local award types that you're pushing, but this is really only meant for integration. Whereas status, role, etc., these are all items that can be configured for when you're adding your manual projects to the system. There was a question about how questionnaire interacts with COI. So that's actually fairly involved. And I am going to need to move over to protocols soon. So Noah, maybe we could find some time to talk about that separately. Okay. The last thing that I want to show is I want to show what a multiple rule setup looks like in the system. So I opened up the rules for my awards. And if I come here for default, I can say I want my general COI disclosures and PHS specifically to require disclosure according to this rule. And I can come down and I can put in the roles and statuses and the award types. And then I can choose to turn on or not to turn on questionnaire-based evaluation. But I may have something very different for 700U. So the 700U regulation only asks for disclosure from the principal investigator. So I can associate completely different rules with the sponsors that are covered by the 700U policy. So if I come here, I want to check my statuses, and we're going to look at active and pending, and maybe because 700U or a different policy is covering nonprofits and foundations and corporate, that covers a lot of unfunded. I just want to look at grants and contracts and cooperative agreements. So I can save that. And now I can have this very different set of functionality that applies to my federal projects as opposed to what applies to the rest of my projects. Does this make sense in the ability to set up multiple rules in the system for COI disclosure? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to protocols, and we're going to talk through some of the configuration options in the protocol system. Give me just a moment. I'll try a different environment that might be a little faster. There we go. So one thing I want to mention just out the gate, you'll notice over here on the left-hand side, we have human configuration, animals configuration, and IBC configuration. If you've used the protocol system, you know that normally that would say IRB configuration and IACUC configuration. We can localize some of the fields in the system. And if you're in a different regulatory domain, then we could change those labels. So say for our Canadian customers, we don't list IRB or IACUC. Those terms don't apply in their regulatory domain. Similarly, we have some schools right now that are looking at, doing SCRO review with their human subjects protocols. We might change to a different term that it's more encompassing. We can't change every filter or every label in the system, but there are options for that. We do need to make those changes though. That right now isn't an exposed configuration, but I wanted to be sure to mention that that is available. So next, I'm going to come here and click on one of the configurations. So similar to what we just went through with COI, I just want to talk through the options that are available in the system. So the first, we have an option to turn on allowing amend and renewal in one action. Normally, amendment and renewal are two separate types of submissions. They have different forms associated with them, but some schools do want to be able to do both as a single submission, just to minimize kind of the noise in the system, minimize the number of actions that need to be submitted. A lot of times continuing review comes in with a couple other small changes, maybe personnel. And so allowing that to be combined can be a time saver. For some institutions though, they want to keep their submissions simplified. So you have the option to make this available to your researchers or not, and you would configure that here. The next option is allowing multiple pending amendments. So if you turn this on, you can do multiple amendments at the same time. This will also allow you to do a renewal and an amendment at the same time. So you can do them as separate submissions, but routing simultaneously. That could be an entire presentation unto itself. It's an involved system. When you create an amendment with this option turned on, you choose which sections of the protocol as configured in your template you're making changes to, and then those sections can't be changed in other amendments until that amendment is finalized. So that's how we avoid data collisions. And then when an amendment is approved, that data is pushed out not only to a new approved protocol, but to any amendments or renewals that are in progress, so that you can see then, if I approve this document, this is what the protocol is going to look like after I approve it. And so all of that is kept in sync. It does add a fair bit of complexity. This was originally something that came up from larger institutions, but I have recently had some interest from smaller institutions as well. So there are definitely places, if you have a very large amendment that has to include the sponsor, but then there's a small personnel amendment on the side, and you don't want the big complicated change to hold up the personnel change. Those are really the places where multiple pending amendments becomes very useful. The next option that you can turn on or off, allow deletion of protocols never submitted. So over time, you have researchers that are going to start protocols and either leave them in progress or abandon them. And it can really build up kind of a burden of messy data in the system that you just don't want to have to navigate. And so this will allow you, if you abandon a protocol that has never been submitted, there is no communication with the office that needs to be preserved. It's just a document that a researcher or their admin started and never did anything with. If they abandon it, they will then have the option to delete it. Again, it's optional. You can turn it on or off, and it is not applied automatically to abandoned protocols. One question that comes up a lot when I talk about this function is there any way to sort of auto delete via a schedule? We have not built that at this time. There is some interest in that, but there's also concern about inadvertently deleting things. We used to actually hide all protocols that were abandoned even, and that caused issues for some schools. They really wanted to be able to get back to that data. So we might build something like that eventually, but we really want to see how this feature gets used first. We're just being conservative about this because we don't want to risk losing data in the protocol system. In terms of a question, yes, they do have to click abandon in the system. And once they have clicked abandon, if that protocol was never submitted, then they can delete it. So this does require the abandoned status. Next, we have some permission options. Users should automatically be able to create protocols. This relates to that user role in groups that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. So if you have this turned off, if you want someone to be able to create a protocol, you need to add them to that user role, or admins will automatically gain the ability to create a protocol, but no one else will. So if I come in, I'm a brand new person and I just come to the protocol screen, I have no permissions provisioned to me, I won't be able to do anything in the system. But if you have this option turned on, everyone is basically treated like they have the user role for this protocol. And so they'll be able to come in, brand new person, click create protocol, and it'll go through all the normal submission and workflow steps. So that takes all that user management out. You might occasionally get some protocols that from someone that isn't fully qualified to be a PI, and you might have to clean that up a little bit. But given the amount of time savings in user management, the institutions I've worked with have all opted to go this route because on the whole, it's less work. The next option, only the principal investigator can do the initial submit on protocols. That should really say on protocol submissions, because it does apply to the main protocol as well as to renewals and amendments and closeout requests. So this is our way of capturing principal investigator certification. They have to be the ones to go in and press that submit button. An admin can submit on their behalf, so a central admin, but no one else can. So if you're a co-investigator or you are someone else in the department just helping the PI, you will not be able to submit the protocol if you are not listed as the principal investigator on the document, if this is turned on. If it's turned off, anyone with full edit rights to a document can submit. I want to come down now into the notifications and mention the notify PI to submit notification. So we have a notification that goes out that if this is active and if the PI is required to submit option is active, they both have to be turned on. An extra button will appear that says notify PI to submit on the protocol. You can click on that, send this notification. That action will be stored in the activity log in terms of who sent the notification, when it was sent, the text of the notification itself. That'll all be kept in the history of the protocol. But both of the options do have to be turned on. They interact with each other. The next option, committee members may leave action items. If we turn this option on, then if a committee member gets to a protocol, they click to it through an agenda that's been published to them for their particular committee for a meeting, then they will have the option of adding action items, so adding comments to individual fields. Then the admin can look at those, collate them before a meeting, make them visible on the minutes or the agenda items so that they're prepared to be discussed at the meeting. In a lot of cases, this will only be done by one or two designated reviewers before a meeting, presenters basically, but some institutions do want their entire committee to have access to do that. And so turning that on makes that possible in the system. So next, we have PDF watermarking. If we turn watermarking on, so you can see there's a lot that appears after I turn this on, then we get to choose which attachment types are watermarked in the system. So those are attachment types listed on that final attachment list that's part of the protocol by default. If you do not use that attachment list, then you can't filter by attachment type. Every other attachment not in that list in the protocol will be watermarked by default. We did that because some institutions really like having their attachments sort of in context right next to the part of the protocol that it relates to. They want all their consent documents in the consent section. But then it's very difficult for us to sort of know what's configured in the form in this configuration interface. So if you want to keep a tight control over what is watermarked, then you do want to keep all of that in the attachment list. So then we get down and you can choose what displays. So first you can decide, do you want only your approved attachments to be watermarked, or do you want all attachments, including the unapproved ones, to be watermarked? And you can choose which fields should display on the watermark. We are talking about potentially adding a field or two here over time. So this may change, but the fundamentals of I want the status, the protocol number, the approval date and expiration date to display, and it will either display on an unapproved attachment in a big red diagonal bar, or if it's approved, it's a very discrete gray watermark at the bottom that confirms that that is an appropriate approved attachment, but doesn't get in the way of the content itself. Only PDFs can be watermarked. So you do have to upload before you approve. The document needs to be in a PDF format before the final approval, so it will receive that. It'll move back to the unapproved watermark if it's suspended, if it's an old superseded version, anything that takes it out of that approved status, you won't get that approved watermark. Next, we have notifications. So there are a wide array of notifications in the system. Couldn't possibly go through all of them, but I want to go through a couple specific things. So this interface that I'm showing you here, this is in pre-release. We have a couple customers using it in production. If you don't see this when you log into protocols and you want to use the functionality I'm about to show you, then just send in a Zendesk ticket and we can activate this for you. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the continuing review reminder. So we have an IRB continuing review reminder, and we have all the same options here about, you know, putting in text, and we have some formatting. We can add placeholder codes. So the placeholder codes are going to, instead of the code, the real notification will display, say, the full name of the PI or the date this particular action that triggered this notification was taken, the review type of the protocol, et cetera. It'll show that in the text of the notification. We also have these intervals we can put in place. We want this to go out 30 days before or after the continuing review date, 15, etc. But the other thing I can do is I can add a new template. So we're going to get our default text. But in here, I want to put urgent. I want to have a different subject. And I want to set this up so that it's bolded and underlined. It's just very, very urgent. And I want this to go out 1 day before the continuing review. And we'll say 5 days after the continuing review. And I can save that. And so we don't need this 1 day before to send out this template. We want it to send out the urgent template as an example. So this lets you have a little bit more nuance about what happens at various points in time relative to these reminder dates. The other place this multiple template functionality can be useful is, say you want to send a submission notice to the department people that say you've successfully submitted your proposal or your protocol, maybe only to the PI, maybe to everyone. You've been listed on the submitted protocol. Make sure that's appropriate. But then you want a notice to go into the central office that says this was just submitted. Here's the type and information about the protocol. Here's a direct link, and really build that notification to help with the central office business process. You can send those different notifications, and you can configure different recipients. So the other thing I want to show is here we have those departmental lead roles configured. So this is that new role functionality. By default, notifying department leads about something is generally going to be associated with submission of a protocol, but we did make it available to the entire system. So if a department chair says, I want to know, when protocols are suspended in my department, I want to be aware of that. You could set that up as a standard procedure. We think this is primarily going to be used for submission, maybe approval, but if there are times where you want to notify the department based on other actions in the system, that is available to you, and you could absolutely configure that. So let's enable this. And then you can see this saved automatically. And then I can close out. And if I come down here, I can see now that this has 2 templates associated with it. My recommendation is, if you have any of these you don't want to be active, remove the templates completely, because then they'll show up as 0 and you can actually tell the difference. So I don't recommend having sort of inactive templates hanging out there. When you add a new template, you can see it has our out of the box text. You're not going to lose that configuration. So yeah, I just recommend only listing templates that are active. So we have a few more minutes. There are a few more things I want to show here. So next is the correspondence templates. Sorry about that. The first time you open the correspondence templates, it's a little small. It's something that we're hoping to improve on. So I wanted to show here that you can add you can add images to your correspondence templates. These are the formal letters that are generated in the system on an approval action, a disapproval action, etc. And so you can put your university logo there. And for a lot of institutions, having the logo listed on the approval correspondence is very important, creating that kind of letterhead configuration. We also have a couple of unusual replacement tokens in the correspondence that aren't available in the notifications. So if I look at placeholder code, I can list the action comment, that comment that's made right after you take an action in the system. We have our approval comment, which is kind of the same thing, but it depends on the action being taken. But we also have list of protocol attachment attributes. And that is going to put this in place. It's kind of long, it's complicated. It's going to default to display every attachment in the attachment list. Again, you have to use the main attachment list that comes out of the box to populate your attachments on your approval correspondence, and every type. So we can see here, we can choose which fields from that list we want to display. It will display custom fields that we add to that list if we've changed what we ask for people to enter from our attachment list. And then it's going to look at attachment type. And we can decide which attachment types we want to put here. Maybe some of the attachment types just represent supporting documentation. They aren't really things that are being approved as part of protocol approval. So you can decide what you want to display here. On every approval, this will show the most up-to-date list of attachments that displays or that are part of the protocol. I noticed there's a question, can you stop notification if the person responded or completed their form? That is the default configuration in the system. So the continuing review, the expiration notifications only send until a renewal has been submitted. So once the renewal is submitted, they will stop. If you started a renewal but you haven't submitted it yet, you will continue to get those notifications. So that's not configurable, but it is the default behavior in the system. So we only have a couple minutes left. I want to quickly touch on ancillary review. There are a couple other configurations here, turning on checklists, but ancillary review is a little bit more nuanced. So these are additional review groups that you can add to a protocol once it's been submitted for review. So you can see here, biosafety, radiation. We do have a couple institutions that have used this to handle departmental approval. So right now, ancillary review can only be assigned manually once a protocol is submitted. So you get the protocol into your office, your triage group looks at it and says, all right, we need it to go to these couple of other units based on the information in the form. We do have planned functionality for later this year to allow ancillary review to be automatically assigned based on data in the form. So I've indicated, yes, there's recombinant DNA on here. The biosafety ancillary review will automatically be assigned upon submission. So the automatic assignment we have is really designed, for biosafety radiation, that sort of standalone singular assignment. But some institutions have gone in and created an ancillary review for each department because they need to capture that approval. You can come here and it's fairly easy to search for an ancillary review. So I can come here and add a new review and say, psychology department approver, PSY, DA. And then I can come here and I can add my contact. So I'm going to look them up the same way that I would look up any other user in a type ahead. Ah, I see. I misspelled their name. There we go. So I want to add Damon Ralston as a reviewer for psychology, and I'm going to save. I've added this in humans. So if I save this and I jump over to animal configuration, it is listed here, but it's inactive. And that's specifically because if someone takes the time to capture the approvers for a given department or for, say, biosafety, and maybe the other protocol types aren't using that yet, but they want to, we don't want everyone to have to do that research themselves, but it defaults to inactive until the animals or IACUC administrator says, I want to use this on my protocol. So we tried to balance local control with tools that would help save research time and prevent, multiple offices having to maintain the same information. So that gets through the majority of the configurations. As I said, I'm going to go into much more detail on all of the template items tomorrow. We're right up to the edge of the hour. I apologize for that. I hope everyone's able to make it over to the keynote fairly quickly. And I hope that I've responded to most of the questions from the chat. If anyone does want to know more about the questionnaire details in COI, I'm going to see if I can work with the team to get documentation out on that fairly soon. It's been pretty well tested currently. And since there were questions about that, I'll try to get that out in more detail. All right, thank you all. I hope you have a fantastic Kuali Days, and thanks for attending my marathon sprint.